7 fatal mistakes that led to the fall of the Crusaders. When the wave of crusading fervor swept across Europe at the end of the 11th century, few suspected that this holy war would transform into a nearly 2-century exhausting struggle full of blood, confusion, and often futility. The Crusaders, who set out with white mantles and red crosses to save the Holy Land, did not only have to contend with distance and foreign culture. They had to face their own weaknesses, mistakes, and blindness. These mistakes, of which we will highlight 7 of the most fundamental today, were not mere minor tactical blunders. They were basic errors that repeated from generation to generation and that ultimately led to the collapse of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The first and perhaps most fatal mistake was underestimating the lack of water and supplies. When the Crusaders first arrived in the Middle East, they believed that faith and courage would be enough for victory. But the desert heat, parched lands, and waterless roads soon convinced them otherwise. The worst example occurred in the summer of the year 1187, when the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, under the leadership of Guy de Lusignan, set out against Saladin's forces. Before the Battle of Hattin, the Crusader army marched for 2 days under the scorching sun, while Saladin's light cavalry constantly harassed them. Water supplies quickly ran out, and when the army reached the area around the horns of Hattin, the soldiers were so dehydrated they could barely move. A French knight who survived the catastrophe later recalled, "It was as if the very flames of hell were burning us. My tongue swelled in my mouth, my vision blurred, and only one thought swirled in my head: a sip of water, just one sip of clean water." But there was no water. Saladin's soldiers, meanwhile, had access to fresh water from the nearby Sea of Galilee and exploited this mercilessly. Some Arab chroniclers write that Muslim warriors deliberately poured out water in front of the thirsty Crusaders and mocked them. This water shortage did not just represent an inconvenience, it broke the Crusader army physically and psychologically. When battle finally came, the knights were so weak they could barely grasp a weapon. Their armor, which under normal circumstances would have provided protection, now pressed upon them like a terrible burden. The horses were also exhausted, and when Saladin's troops attacked, the Crusader army was practically incapable of resistance. This mistake, however, did not occur only at Hattin. During the Crusades, it repeatedly happened that Christian armies overestimated their own strength and underestimated the cruelty of the desert. Building supply lines, securing water supplies, understanding local conditions, all of this was secondary compared to general enthusiasm, and this led again and again to catastrophe. The second serious mistake was internal division and rivalry among Crusader leaders. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which arose thanks to the success of the First Crusade at the very end of the 11th century, European nobles quickly created a complex feudal system. But this system did not bring stability. On the contrary, individual barons and counts constantly competed for power, territory, and influence. Different factions formed at court. Some held the so-called Poulain view, those nobles who were born or grew up in the Holy Land and who understood local conditions and often negotiated with Muslim neighbors. They were opposed to newly arrived Crusaders, whom the locals considered too reckless and incompetent. A particularly tragic example of this division was the conflict between Count Raymond of Tripoli and Renaud de Châtillon. Raymond was an experienced statesman who had lived in the Holy Land for decades and understood the region's politics. Renaud, on the other hand, was an adventurous knight who cared little for diplomacy. When Saladin offered peace, Raymond argued for negotiations, while Renaud and his supporters demanded war. This division was fatal. King Guy de Lusignan, who was not a particularly strong personality, was unable to unite his court. When he had to decide whether to accept Raymond's cautious advice or Renaud's reckless belligerence, pressure and questions of honor forced him to choose war. The result was the catastrophe at Hattin. But internal rivalry was not present only at the political level. The military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and later the Teutonic Knights also competed among themselves. Each order operated according to its own rules, its own masters, and its own interests. In battle, it often happened that one order was unwilling to support another, or that they fought uncoordinatedly due to rivalry. One contemporary chronicler bitterly noted, "If the Crusaders had devoted half the energy they spent on mutual intrigues to fighting the Muslims, Jerusalem would still be in Christian hands today." The third fatal mistake was excessive self-confidence and recklessness. In the culture of Crusader knights, courage and recklessness were among the highest virtues. According to the knightly ideal, it was better to suffer a glorious defeat than a cowardly retreat. However, this attitude in the Middle East, where the enemy used a completely different method of fighting, had catastrophic consequences. Muslim armies were based on light cavalry. Their fast, mobile troops did not stop for direct combat with heavily armored knights, but shot arrows from a distance and then withdrew. This tactic was unnerving for Crusader knights who were accustomed to direct knightly duels, and they often fell into the trap of pursuing the enemy who appeared to be fleeing. Renaud de Chatillon was perhaps the purest embodiment of this recklessness. This Norman knight who arrived in the Holy Land and married the wealthy widow of the Princess of Antioch was famous for his cruelty and determination, but he also became known for rashly provoking Saladin. On one occasion, he attacked a Muslim trade caravan that was transporting Saladin's relatives. This attack violated the existing truce and provided Saladin with a direct pretext for war. When Raymond and others warned Renaud that his action could have fatal consequences, the Norman knight replied, "I am lord of my own lands, and I ask permission from no one when I fight my enemy." This irresponsible recklessness led not only to Renaud's own death — Saladin personally executed him after Hattin — but also contributed to the destruction of the entire kingdom. But it was not just individual knights who were reckless. Crusader command also tended to underestimate the enemy. They thought that heavily armored European cavalry would always overcome more lightly armored Eastern horsemen. This was sometimes true, as was proven at Arsuf, but only when circumstances were favorable. In open terrain, without water, in an exhausted state, armor was more of a disadvantage than an advantage. If you are also interested in the fascinating and tragic world of the Crusades and want to learn more stories about these forgotten heroes and mistakes, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Press the like button and stay with us so you don't miss the next episodes. The fourth critical mistake was ignoring local allies and native Christians. When the Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land, they did not step onto empty, uninhabited territory. Significant Christian communities lived in the region: Armenians, Syrian Jacobite Christians, Maronite Christians, and others, who for centuries had been reconciled to the fact of Muslim rule and had developed a functioning coexistence. These local Christians possessed invaluable knowledge about conditions in the region, about the climate, local politics, and the internal workings of Muslim society. Many of them spoke both Arabic and some Christian language, so they would have been perfect interpreters and intermediaries. But Crusaders coming from the West often overlooked them, distrusted them, and paid no attention to their advice. An Armenian chronicler, whose name has not been preserved, but whose account was saved by a later author, wrote about this. "The Frankish knights came to us as if they knew everything better. They did not ask us where the wells were, they were not interested in which road the merchants travel, and they did not want to know which Muslim leader could be trusted and which could not. They relied only on their own recklessness, and that was their undoing." This mistake became especially apparent when the Crusaders attempted to form alliances with various local powers. There were indeed several successful alliances. For example, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia generally maintained good relations with the Crusaders, but these relationships were not systematically and consistently built, and when help was needed, these potential allies no longer felt any obligation. The fifth mistake, which deeply permeated the Crusader effort, was failure to understand the political complexity of the Muslim world. The Crusaders tended to treat all Muslims as one unified enemy, although reality was much more nuanced. The Muslim world in the 11th and 12th centuries was deeply divided. The Seljuk Turks, the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt, various Syrian and Mesopotamian emirates, all acted according to their own interests and often fought among themselves. The First Crusade was so successful precisely because it exploited this division. When the Crusaders crossed Anatolia and arrived in Syria, local Muslim rulers were unable to unite against them. Moreover, some Muslim leaders even formed alliances with the Crusaders against their own rivals. But as the Crusader presence stabilized, Christian leaders did not consistently exploit these divisions. They did not try to build long-term diplomatic relationships with those Muslim rulers who could have been potential allies. Instead, they treated all Muslims as enemies, which paradoxically contributed to the Muslim world gradually beginning to unite. Saladin's career was built precisely on this. This Kurdish leader, who originally came from a minor military family, achieved power by uniting Egypt and Syria. The ideology of jihad, holy war, was an excellent tool for rallying various Muslim factions behind a single goal. The blindness of the Crusaders lay in not seeing how their own presence contributed to creating enemy unity. An Arab historian, whose work was preserved by later generations, described this process thus: "The Franks thought all Muslims were the same. They did not see the difference between Sunnis and Shiites, did not understand the tensions between Turks and Arabs, and did not notice that the Egyptian Caliphate and the Baghdad Caliph had been rivals for generations." This blindness enabled Saladin to create a unity that was previously unthinkable. The sixth serious mistake was that the Crusaders were unable to build a sustainable economy and society in the Holy Land. They tried to transplant the European feudal model into a completely different environment where climate, agriculture, and social structures fundamentally differed from European ones. On the territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, they tried to impose European agricultural methods, but these did not always work. Local Arab and Syrian peasants, who had known the peculiarities of the land for millennia, could often suggest better solutions, but no one asked them. Irrigation systems were often poorly managed. Arable land was not cultivated according to local climatic conditions. Moreover, the economy of the Crusader states largely depended on European supplies and donations. When European enthusiasm waned and fewer pilgrims came, the influx of money decreased, and the economy of the Crusader states went into crisis. They were unable to create a self-sufficient economic system that would ensure their existence long-term. A Venetian merchant who spent years in the Holy Land described the situation thus: "The Franks live here as if it were France or England. They do not notice that they must play by different rules. Local merchants understand business better, local peasants know the land better, but the Frankish lords do not listen to them. And meanwhile, they wonder why things do not work." This economic weakness became especially apparent during wartime periods. When a major military campaign was needed, the Crusader states were unable to independently maintain the necessary army. They always had to wait for European help, which often came late or not at all. The seventh and final mistake we highlight was excessive trust that Europe would always help. At the beginning of the Crusades, enthusiasm was enormous. Popes encouraged the faithful, preachers traveled the lands, and thousands set out to save the Holy Land. But as the decades passed, this enthusiasm gradually faded. European rulers increasingly occupied themselves with their own problems. England and France warred with each other. The Holy Roman Empire struggled with internal conflicts. The Spanish kingdoms devoted themselves to the exhausting work of the Reconquista, the fight against Moorish rule. The Holy Land seemed increasingly distant and increasingly less important. The leaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, however, continued to live in the belief that when they got into trouble, Europe would always come to the rescue. This trust was partially confirmed after the catastrophe at Hattin, when the Third Crusade actually set out and legendary kings like Richard the Lionheart personally participated in the fighting. But long-term, this model was not sustainable. When another great crisis approached in the mid-13th century, European help became increasingly uncertain. The Seventh Crusade, led by the pious French king Louis IX, ended in catastrophic failure in Egypt. The king himself fell into captivity and was freed only for an enormous ransom. This fiasco further decreased European enthusiasm. A Jerusalem nobleman, whose letter has been preserved, described the situation thus: "We feel like castaways in the middle of the sea waiting for rescue. We see fires on the distant shore, we hear bells, but no one comes for us." Europe has forgotten Jerusalem, and we have been left alone in a sea of enemies. And indeed, that was the doom of the Crusader states. Against successive Muslim attacks, there was less and less defense. Castles could not be maintained, soldiers could not be paid, new knights did not arrive in sufficient numbers. And when at the end of the 13th century, the army of the Mamluk Sultan attacked the last Crusader fortresses, Europe was unable, or rather unwilling, to save them. These then are the mistakes that ultimately led to the collapse of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Ignoring supplies, internal division, excessive recklessness, overlooking local allies, failure to understand the complexity of the Muslim world, an unsustainable economy, and excessive trust in European help. Each of these weaknesses caused damage on its own, but together they formed a fatal combination. When at the end of the 13th century Acre fell, the last great Crusader port city, and the last Crusader ships left the shores of the Holy Land, 2 centuries of effort came to an end. The Crusades were not just a military failure. An entire civilizational project collapsed, one that had been burdened from the beginning with mistakes, errors, and blindness. But perhaps from this story we can still learn something. History is not just a chronicle of victors and vanquished. It is a mirror in which we can recognize our own weaknesses as well. The mistakes of the Crusaders, excessive self-confidence, division, failure to understand local conditions, lack of long-term planning, are not characteristic only of the Middle Ages. They are eternal weaknesses of human nature that appear in every age and in every culture. When we study history, we do not do it to glorify or condemn the past, but to understand human nature. And perhaps thereby we become wiser, more experienced, and more sensible. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the tragic mistakes of the Crusades, don't forget to press the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your friends so that as many people as possible can learn about these instructive stories. Write a comment about which mistake you consider the most serious and what you think the solution would have been. And stay with us, because in the following videos we will dive even deeper into the fascinating and cruel world of the Middle Ages,